The boy had grown used to being invisible, in a small, forgotten American village where old wooden houses leaned on each other like weary friends. Life carried on in its slow, steady way. Farmers tended their fields, the blacksmith hammered iron by the dusty road, and children laughed in the schoolyard. Nobody paid much mind to the boy who drifted along the edge of it all, with no roof over his head and no family waiting for him when the sun went down. Had nothing but a threadbare coat, a pair of worn boots with holes in the soles, and the restless hunger of someone who had learned to live with emptiness. Folks saw him sometimes near the general store or by the well, but they looked past him as though he were only a shadow slipping by in the late afternoon. Yet the boy was alive in ways no one could see. He had grown sharp from hardship, watching the world closely, listening more than speaking. He carried inside him a quiet fire, though he never spoke of it. His nights were spent beneath old porches or against the trunks of willow trees, his head tilted toward the stars as though they might whisper to him why he had been left alone. He didn't expect kindness anymore. What he did expect, always, was the struggle of another day. It was near the river bank. Just as the late summer sun was sinking low, that something happened to shake his lonely world. The river ran fast and strong, fed by rains that had swollen its current. The boy went there often, not because it offered him anything, but because the sound of rushing water filled the silence he carried around like a burden. That evening he saw a shape thrashing in the middle of the current, a dog, caught in the furious pull of the river. Its brown fur was slick with water, its paws striking wildly at the surface, eyes wide with the pure panic of a creature that knows death is close. For a moment the boy stood frozen. No one else was near. He could have turned away. But something inside him stirred, something deeper than hunger, sharper than loneliness. He kicked off his worn boots, gritted his teeth, and plunged into the icy water. The current fought him hard, dragging at his thin frame, but he pressed on with all the strength he had. The dog yelped once before the boy reached it, grabbing hold of its scruff and pulling with desperate will toward the bank. His lungs burned, his arms shook, yet somehow he dragged both himself and the animal onto the muddy shore. The dog collapsed beside him, coughing up water, its chest rising and falling fast. The boy lay beside it, gasping, every bone in his body trembling. He did not know why he had done it. Had no food to give, no shelter to share. Still, he reached out and touched the dog's wet fur. The animal lifted its head, eyes meeting his, and in that moment there was something exchanged between them, something wordless, like a promise. By the time night fell, the boy had made a bed of dried grass and leaves beneath a leaning oak tree. The dog, shivering and weak, pressed close against him for warmth. For the first time in longer than he could remember, the boy did not feel entirely alone. He whispered to the dog, soft words no one else would ever hear. The stars wheeled above them. The river still roared in the dark, but the boy felt a strange calm. Something told him that saving the dog had changed more than either of them could yet understand. Morning arrived with a strange stillness. The village stirred, a whack roosters crowed, smoke rose from chimneys, and wagons rattled down the dirt road. The boy rubbed the sleep from his eyes, stretched, and looked out over the hills beyond the river. That was when he saw them. Figures, standing tall in the mist, silent and unyielding. At first he thought his weary eyes were playing tricks, but as the haze lifted, he counted them, dozens of riders, horses lined up like a wall of shadow against the rising sun. They were Apaches. Their presence struck the land with an eerie quiet. The riders did not move, yet their stillness carried weight. The boy's breath caught in his chest. He had heard the stories whispered in the village, stories of warriors who rode like the wind, of scouts who moved unseen through forest and desert alike. Some folks spoke of them with fear, others with a grudging respect, but never had the boy imagined he would see them gathered. Watching, their eyes set upon him, the dog beside him barked once, low and uncertain. The boy's heart pounded, his hands tightening into fists, though he had nothing to defend himself with. He could not understand why they were there, why they stood in silence as though waiting. It was as if the river, the rescue, and the promise he had felt in the dog's eyes had carried him into some turning point. he'd never asked for. The village had not yet noticed. Life went on just behind him, the ringing hammer of the blacksmith, the voices of farmers calling to one another, the laughter of children. They had no idea what waited at the edge of their world. And the boy, homeless and nameless, sat with a wet-furred dog at his side, facing an army he could neither escape nor explain. A cold wind rustled through the grass. One of the Apache riders lifted his hand, and the others shifted in their saddles. The boy's heart felt like it might burst through his ribs. He did not know if he was about to be taken, judged, or defended. He only knew that something larger than himself had arrived. Whatever came next would change everything. And as the sun climbed higher, spilling gold across the land, the boy understood that the river had given him more than a dog to care for. It had carried him into a story that was just beginning, a story that would decide not only his fate, but perhaps the fate of the entire village. The riders remained still, their faces unreadable, the air heavy with unspoken intent. The boy swallowed hard, the dog pressing closer to his side, and waited for the first word, the first sign, the first spark of what was about to unfold. The boy stood frozen on the riverbank, his breath coming in short bursts as the dog pressed against his side. The Apaches did not move, their figures like stone against the morning light. Their silence felt heavier than thunder, as though the earth itself held its breath, waiting for something to break. The boy's mind raced. He had no reason to believe they meant him harm, but he had even less reason to believe they meant him kindness. He was only a ragged boy, with nothing but an empty belly and a half-drowned dog. Why would a gathering of warriors set their eyes on him? The riders remained still, their horses shifting restlessly beneath them. A few of the men carried long spears that glinted faintly in the sunlight, while others held bows slung across their backs. Their hair hung long and dark, braided with beads and feathers that caught the breeze. The boy could see the patterns painted across some of their faces, lines that seemed both fierce and solemn, as though drawn from a language older than the village itself. He swallowed hard, his mouth dry, wishing he could fade into the tall grass. Behind him, life in the village carried on unaware. The blacksmith's hammer struck iron, steady as a heartbeat. A wagon wheel creaked as it rolled down the dusty main road. From the schoolhouse came the muffled sound of a lesson being recited in unison. No one yet saw the gathering of horsemen just beyond the river bend. The boy thought of shouting, of running back to warn them, but his legs would not move. Something told him that if he fled, it would only draw attention he could not bear. The dog let out a low growl, its body tense. The boy whispered a hush, pressing his hand gently over its neck. He didn't know why, but he felt that the animal, with its sharp eyes and bristling fur, somehow understood more than he did. Perhaps saving the dog had tied him to a thread of fate he could not see. Perhaps the Apaches had come for reasons that stretched far beyond the river, beyond his lonely life. The thought made his skin prick. As the minutes dragged on, one of the riders finally dismounted. He moved with calm purpose, not rushing, not threatening. His moccasins touched the grass without a sound, and his eyes stayed locked on the boy. The boy's chest tightened, and he wanted to step back, but his feet held firm. The man walked closer until he stood only a few paces away. His face was marked with years, not cruelly, but with the weathered strength of someone who had seen many seasons. The boy dared not speak. His voice felt trapped in his throat. He half expected the man to draw a weapon, but instead, the Apache lowered himself into a crouch, resting one hand lightly on the earth. He studied the boy the way one might study a trail in the woods, searching for signs unseen. The silence stretched. Then, without a word, the man turned his gaze to the dog. The dog's growl faded into a whine, its tail twitching uncertainly. The boy laid his hand firmly on the animal's back, as if to show it they were together. Something flickered in the Apache's eyes, though the boy could not tell if it was approval or warning. The man rose again, slow and deliberate, and walked back toward the line of riders. Not a single word had been spoken. The boy's heart hammered harder than before. What did they see in him? Why linger here watching? He wanted answers, yet he feared them. The dog licked at his hand, grounding him in the moment, reminding him he was not entirely alone. As the sun climbed higher, the warriors turned their horses and began to move. Not away, not toward the horizon, but closer toward the village. The boy's breath caught. Still they said nothing, but the intent was clear enough. Their long line of riders stretched across the field like a shadow creeping in with the day. The boy rose to his feet, the dog following close, his legs trembling. As he realized he could not stop what was coming, he could only watch. The villagers soon noticed. A farmer carrying a sack of grain stopped in the middle of the road, his eyes widening. A group of children ran toward the well, their laughter faltering as they caught sight of the riders. By one, doors opened, voices called, and a ripple of alarm spread through the narrow streets. The blacksmith stepped out from his forge, wiping his soot-stained hands, his jaw tightening as he stared across the field. The boy hung back at the edge of it all, uncertain if he belonged among the villagers or among the silent figures who advanced. He felt caught between two worlds, neither of which had ever fully claimed him. Remembered nights when the villagers turned him away from warm doorsteps, and he remembered the long hunger that came with being no one's son. Now, standing there with the dog pressed against his leg, he wondered if perhaps that loneliness had carried him here for a reason. The Apaches halted just beyond the first fence line, their horses stamping the earth. Still no weapons were raised, but neither did they come as friends. Their leader, the man who had crouched before the boy, stepped forward once again. His voice finally carried across the air, low and steady, though the boy could not make sense of the words. It was not the language of the village, but something older, rooted deep in the land. The villagers murmured nervously among themselves, shifting their weight, uncertain whether to retreat or to stand their ground. The boy's stomach turned with unease. He could feel that something bound him to this moment, though he could not yet grasp what. He thought of the river again, of the moment he had chosen to leap in after the drowning dog. That decision had seemed simple: save the helpless, do what no one else would. But perhaps it had set in motion something far greater, something he was not prepared for. The dog barked sharply, breaking the tense silence. Every head turned, both Apache and villager alike. The boy flushed with heat, gripping the animals. Fur to calm it, but the damage was done. All eyes were now on him. The villagers stared as though noticing him for the first time, the boy they had ignored now standing at the center of something they could not understand. And the Apache riders, too, fixed their gaze on him, their expressions unreadable, their silence pressing heavier with every heartbeat. The boy felt exposed, as if some invisible line had been drawn, and he was the one standing directly upon it. He wanted to vanish into the grass, to crawl back to the shadows where he had lived so long. But there was no hiding anymore. His choice at the river had pulled him out of invisibility and placed him here, between an anxious village and an unyielding army. The leader of the Apaches spoke again. This time, pointing not at the village, not at the land, but at the boy himself. The words rolled from his tongue with authority, carrying weight even though the boy could not understand them. The villagers shifted uneasily, voices rising in fear and confusion. The blacksmith muttered something under his breath. A woman clutched her child close. The boy's knees weakened, but he held his ground, the dog pressing tight against him. The air trembled with suspense, as though the moment could collapse into fire or into peace with the slightest spark. The boy knew nothing of what was being asked of him, but he felt in his bones that it was not small. The dog barked again, and the Apaches did not flinch. Instead, the leader lowered his hands slowly, almost as if waiting for the boy to step forward. The boy's heart pounded in his ears. He wanted to run, to turn back into the nameless shadow he had always been. But something deeper pulled at him. The same force that had driven him into the river, the same quiet fire that kept him alive when all else had failed. He tightened his grip on the dog's fur, lifted his chin, took one trembling step toward the waiting riders. The villagers gasped. The Apache stood firm. The dog barked once more, the sound echoing across the quiet fields. And in that suspended moment, the boy understood that whatever lay ahead, he was no longer invisible, no longer forgotten. He had been seen, chosen perhaps, though for what he did not yet know, the leader's eyes did not leave him. The village seemed to fall away, the noise dimming, the world narrowing, until it was only the boy, the dog, and the silent army waiting for his next move. The boy's step toward the Apache leader felt like stepping off the edge of the world. His legs were shaking, but his chin stayed lifted, if only because he sensed that to bow or falter would carry meaning he didn't understand. The dog padded at his side, fur still damp, eyes sharp. The villagers behind him murmured and shifted, caught between fear and curiosity. None dared move closer, yet none pulled away either. Every breath in the air seemed to wait for what would come next. The Apache leader studied him without blinking, his gaze so steady the boy felt as though he were being read like a page in a book. He pointed once more, speaking words the boy could not make sense of. But even without understanding the language, the weight of those words pressed against the boy's chest. The villagers muttered louder now. Some hissed for the boy to come back, to step away. Others whispered that he must have brought this on them, that trouble followed him like a shadow. The boy heard their voices, but he could not turn away. Something stronger than fear pinned him where he stood. Another rider dismounted, younger than the first, his face fierce and watchful. He carried a bow, though the string was loose, the arrow unnotched. Dow! His steps were deliberate as he walked toward the boy. The dog bristled, but the man did not flinch. He stopped a short distance away, staring hard at the boy, then lowered his gaze to the dog. A silence fell again, the kind that seemed to stretch the ground tight beneath everyone's feet. The young warrior placed a hand against his chest, then gestured outward, toward the wide land beyond the hills. The boy could not decipher the meaning, but he felt certain it was not random. This was no accident. They had not come here by chance. Behind him, the blacksmith muttered darkly, "It's the boy. They're here because of him." The words carried enough that others caught them, and the murmur of agreement rose like dry leaves stirred by wind. The boy clenched his fists. What had always been invisible, unwanted? Now, for the first time, every eye was on him, and it was with suspicion rather than welcome. He wanted to shout that he had done nothing, that he had no idea why the Apaches watched him as if he mattered. But his throat stayed locked. The leader raised his hand again, and the young warrior stepped back. The riders on horseback shifted, their horses restless. The boy thought for a moment that they might advance, but instead, the leader pointed toward the river, the very place where only the day before the boy had thrown himself into the water. To save the drowning dog? The gesture was unmistakable. Somehow they knew. The boy's stomach twisted. Had they seen him? Or had word traveled faster than he could imagine? How could something so small, so personal, draw the gaze of an entire army? The villagers did not see it the same way. To them, the gesture was unclear, and fear was louder than reason. A woman pulled her child behind her, calling for others to close their doors. A farmer grabbed hold of a shovel, his hands trembling but determined. The panic edged closer with each passing second. The boy saw it in their eyes. They were ready to blame him, to cast him as the reason for danger standing at their fences. The dog barked sharply, the sound bouncing off the hills. The leader did not react with anger. Instead, he tilted his head, his eyes softening, just barely. The boy caught it, though he doubted anyone else did. The connection was there, faint but undeniable. The dog mattered. The rescue mattered. And he, the boy with nothing, was caught in the middle of it. The Apaches did not attack, not yet. Instead, the leader gave a signal, and the riders pulled back slightly, their line easing away from the village but not disappearing. They lingered just beyond the fields, a watchful wall of silence. It was both mercy and warning. The villagers exhaled in shaky relief, but the tension remained like smoke in the air. That night, the village gathered in the meeting hall, voices sharp and fearful. The boy slipped in quietly, the dog closed at his feet, but eyes darted to him as soon as he entered. Whispers rippled through the room. Some wanted to send him away, to drive him into the hills where the Apaches seemed to want him. Others argued it was too dangerous to anger the riders by casting him out. The blacksmith's voice rose above. The rest, heavy with suspicion. They pointed at him. Him. If we keep him here, we invite their wrath. If we send him, maybe they'll leave us be. The boy's stomach sank, but he said nothing. He had no words that could convince them otherwise. He wanted to believe he had no connection to the warriors outside their fields. But deep down, he knew the truth was more complicated. The dog pressed closer against his leg, as though reminding him he was not alone. Later, when the meeting broke, the boy slipped back to the edge of the village. The fields were dark, the moon casting pale silver across the land. And there just beyond the fence, the riders still waited, unmoving. Their silhouettes were carved against the horizon, watchful, patient. The boy shivered. They had not left. They would not leave. Not until something was decided. In the days that followed, life in the village grew tense. Work slowed, laughter vanished, and every eye turned toward the horizon where the silent riders stood. Crops went untended, the blacksmith's forge grew cold, and even the children stayed quiet. Fear held the town in its grip. Through it all, the boy felt the weight of every glance cast his way. Some were filled with pity, but most with suspicion. The dog never left his side. It seemed to sense the danger, always alert, its ears pricked toward the riders who never moved far. At night, the boy dreamed of the river, of water dragging him down, of unseen hands pulling him up. Each time he woke, he wondered if the Apaches were the current or the salvation waiting on the bank. He began to notice things others did not. Sometimes, in the still hours before dawn, a single rider would leave the group, circling the village like a shadow before returning to the line. Once he thought he saw the young warrior watching him from the edge of the trees, silent as a ghost. It was not hatred he read in the man's face, but something else, something measured, as though waiting for him to act. The boy also saw how the villagers' unease deepened. The supplies grew scarce as fewer dared to travel the road to neighboring towns. The blacksmith argued more fiercely that the boy should be cast out. The storekeeper avoided him altogether, yet there were a few who softened. An older woman left a piece of bread by the well where he often sat. A farmhand gave him a quiet nod instead of a scowl. Not everyone believed he was the cause, though. Few dared speak it aloud. Still, the tension only grew. The Apaches did not leave. The villagers grew restless, trapped between fear of the riders and fear of what might happen if they forced the boy away. Each sunrise brought no answer, only another day of uneasy waiting. The boy's heart carried both dread and curiosity. He could not stop asking himself the same question: why him? Why the river, the dog, the pointing finger of the leader? He felt caught in a story he did not understand, a thread that tied him to warriors and whispers alike, and the longer it stretched, the tighter the knot became, binding not just him, but the whole village in its grip. And though the days dragged on, one truth became clear. The riders were not merely watching, they were waiting for something. That had not yet come. The nights grew heavier with each passing day, and the boy felt the weight pressing down on his chest, as though the air itself thickened around him. The riders never left their place beyond the fields. They were a silent wall, steady and unyielding, their campfires glowing like watchful eyes in the dark. The villagers no longer pretended to live as they had before. Every sound of a horse in the distance, every faint crackle of fire from the hills kept them awake. The boy knew they blamed him, even when they said nothing, felt it in the way their eyes followed him, and the way doors closed quicker when he walked past. The dog stayed close at all hours. Sometimes late at night, it would lift its head and growl low, ears turning toward the fields where the Apaches waited. The boy would hold the animal tight, whispering soft words, though he didn't believe them himself. He tried to convince himself that they were only waiting for something, that perhaps soon they would leave. But deep down, he knew it was not. So simple. One evening, as the sun bled into the horizon, the village held another meeting in the hall. This one was angrier than before. The blacksmith slammed his fist on the table, his voice rising like thunder. They wait for him. They will not leave until we hand him over. Every day we hesitate, we risk the whole village. You all know it. The boy sat in the corner, head low, the dog pressed against his legs. He heard whispers of agreement, a rising tide of voices saying what had long been held back. But there were others who hesitated. An older woman stood, her voice trembling but steady enough. "We do not know what they want. Sending him out might not save us. It could bring worse." The farmhand who had once nodded at the boy agreed. If they meant to attack, they would have done it already. "Maybe they wait for something we cannot see." The blacksmith's voice cut through them. "Maybe they wait for us to hand him over. Maybe they wait for us to prove we are not fools." He turned then, his eyes burning straight into the boy's. "You've brought this down on us. Do you and that dog? Do you deny it?" The boy's throat tightened. He wanted to shout that he knew nothing, that he had no plan, no secret, no connection. But when he tried to speak, no words came. The silence hung like a verdict. The dog growled, as if answering for him, and the blacksmith sneered. That night, when the meeting broke, the boy did not return to the small shed where he sometimes slept. Instead, he walked to the edge of the fields. The riders were there. Figures half-lit by moonlight. He stood with the dog at his side, staring across the distance, his heart beating so loud it hurt. For a long time, nothing happened. Then the young warrior stepped forward, the same one who had watched him before. He raised his hand and pointed, not at the boy, not at the dog, but at the moon rising over the hills. Then he touched his chest, bowed his head once, and stepped back into the line. The boy didn't understand, but the gesture burned in his mind. It was not threat, it was something else. A signal, perhaps. A reminder that time was moving toward something he could not stop. He walked back to the village with his stomach in knots, knowing the blacksmith was right about one thing. This was far from over. The following days grew more tense. Food was rationed, tempers flared, and the smallest noise in the night sent villagers scrambling for cover. The boy saw it in their eyes, the turning of patience into desperation, and with desperation came danger. He began to wonder not only about the riders outside, but about the people inside the village, which was worse. He could no longer tell. Then, one afternoon, everything changed. The young warrior appeared at the river. The boy had gone there to escape the heavy stairs, the dog splashing at the edge of the current. When he looked up, the man was there, standing on the far bank, watching silently. The boy froze, but the warrior did not move closer. Dipping, he knelt by the river, dipping his hand into the water, and raised it toward the boy. The same gesture the boy himself had made when he had lifted the dog from drowning. The boy's chest tightened. He felt the connection then, sharp as lightning. They had seen. They had known all along. The warrior gave no further sign. He rose, mounted his horse, and rode back to the others. Had gone there to escape the heavy stairs, the dog splashing at the edge of the current. When he looked up, the man was there, standing on the far bank, watching silently. The boy froze, but the warrior did not move closer. Instead, he knelt by the river, dipping his hand into the water, and raised it toward the boy. The same gesture the boy himself had made when he had lifted the dog from drowning. The boy's chest tightened. He felt the connection then, sharp as lightning. Seen. They had known all along. The warrior gave no further sign. He rose, mounted his horse, and rode back to the others. The boy stood rooted in place, the dog dripping wet beside him, as realization began to coil around his heart. Whatever bound into these riders, it had begun with that moment in the river. Saving the dog had not been small. It had set everything into motion. When he returned to the village, the blacksmith was waiting. His eyes narrowed as he caught the boy near the well. "Where have you been?" His voice carried too loud, drawing others near. The boy's silence betrayed him, and the blacksmith's face darkened. "You met with them, didn't you? You're part of this," the villagers muttered, their fear sharpening into something worse. The boy backed away, clutching the dog's fur. He wanted to deny it, but what could he say? Seeing the warrior, though he hadn't chosen it, the silence was all the blacksmith needed. Rough hands grabbed his arm and voices shouted. Some called for him to be thrown out. Others argued it was too dangerous to act rashly. The crowd swelled, anger clashing with fear, and in the middle of it, the boy felt smaller than ever. Before the crowd could tear itself apart, a horn sounded from the fields. The sound was deep, echoing, cutting through every voice at once. Villagers froze, turning toward the horizon. The riders were on the move. For the first time, they rode closer, their line breaking as they advanced toward the edge of the village. The ground shook with the rhythm of their horses, and dust rose like smoke. The boy's breath caught. The dog barked furiously, pulling against his grip. The blacksmith let go of him, his eyes wide as the riders drew nearer. People scattered, some grabbing tools, others clutching children, all of them watching with dread. The Apaches halted at the fence line, closer than they had ever come before. Their leader rode forward, tall and steady, his face unreadable. The boy knew then that the waiting was over. Something was about to happen. The leader raised his hand and the riders behind him stilled. The silence that followed was unbearable. Then, slowly, the leader lifted his arm and pointed again directly at the boy. Every eye turned, the villagers gasped. The blacksmith cursed under his breath. The dog barked louder, straining toward the line of riders. The boy felt his knees weaken, but he did not fall. He had been seen, he had been chosen, for what he still did not know. But there was no turning away now. The leader spoke, his voice carrying across the field. The words were foreign, but the tone was clear. It was a summons. The boy's chest pounded as the villagers whispered frantically around him. Some urged him not to move, others hissed that he must go. The pressure closed in from every side. The dog whined, pressing against him, eyes locked on the riders. Boy looked at the villagers' faces twisted with fear, suspicion, and desperation. Then he looked at the riders' faces calm, watchful, waiting. He stood caught between them, the weight of both worlds crushing down, the river's memory pulling at his heart. The leader lowered his arm, waiting. The silence was so deep the boy could hear his own heartbeat, could feel the dog's breath against his leg. The next step would change everything. And as the night wind swept over the fields, carrying the faint crackle of the Apaches' fires, the boy knew the moment of choice was upon him. The suspense tightened like a rope, pulling him toward something greater than himself, toward a fate neither the village nor the riders would allow him to escape. The boy stood at the center of the village square, every pair of eyes burning into him. The Apache leader's arm was still extended, the finger pointing straight at him, as though there was no other choice, no other path left open. The villagers shifted uneasily, caught between fear of the warriors and fear of what might happen. If they forced the boy to go, the air was tight, brittle, ready to crack. The dog barked again, sharp and wild, and the boy pressed his hand against its neck to steady it. He felt his chest rise and fall too quickly, but somehow his legs held him up. For so long he had been invisible, yet now he was the center of everything. The blacksmith's voice broke the silence, angry and desperate. "Go with them, end this. You've brought us nothing but danger. If they want you, let them take you." A few villagers murmured agreement, their fear spilling into words. Others looked torn, their faces drawn with worry. The boy saw the older, a woman who had once left bread by the well. Her eyes were sad, not angry. The farmhand stood near the back, clenching his fists, as though unsure which side he belonged to. The Apache leader lowered his hand, but his eyes did not leave the boy. Slowly, he guided his horse forward, crossing the fence line that had marked the boundary for days. The riders behind him followed, their presence filling the open ground with quiet force. The villagers backed away, some clutching tools as if they might use them, others pulling their children close. The boy swallowed hard. His heart told him to run, but something deeper told him to stay. He stepped forward, one slow pace, then another, the dog moving with him. The murmurs in the crowd rose into gasps. The distance between him and the Apache leader closed until he could see the faint lines etched across the man's weathered face, the beads woven into his dark hair, the calm strength in his eyes. The leader dismounted. He stood tall and steady, his gaze heavy but not cruel. The boy trembled, but did not step back. Then the leader spoke, his voice low but carrying clearly across the square. The words were not the language of the village, yet the tone was certain, deliberate. When he finished, he placed his hand over his chest and then pointed again at the boy. The boy's throat burned. He had no idea what was being asked of him, but he felt the weight of it all the same. The villagers waited, tense, their fear twisting. Tighter, the blacksmith shouted again, his voice breaking with anger. "This is madness. You'll doom us all." But no one moved. They all waited for the boy. The dog barked once more, and the leader's eyes flickered briefly to the animal before returning to the boy. Slowly, carefully, the leader extended his hand, not in demand, but in offering. The boy's breath caught. He looked back at the villagers, saw the fear, the suspicion, the desperation. Then he looked again at the leader, at the riders who had waited so long without striking, who had chosen patience instead of force. With trembling fingers, the boy reached out and placed his hand against the leader's palm. A ripple moved through the crowd, half gasp, half cry. The leader closed his hand gently around the boy's, not as a captor, but as one acknowledging something already decided. Then he let go and raised his head toward the village, speaking. Once more in the same strong, steady tone, though the villagers could not understand the words, they seemed to understand the meaning. The tension began to ease, just enough for breath to return. Now no attack came, no violence. Instead, the riders shifted back slightly, still watchful, still close. But no longer a wall pressing in. The boy stood rooted, his mind spinning. He did not know why he mattered to them or what they saw in him, but he knew this was the turning point. The river, the dog, the silence of the waiting days, it had all led here. He was no longer invisible. He was no longer unwanted. For reasons he could not yet explain, he had been chosen in the days that followed. The Apaches did not vanish, but they no longer stood like a threat at the village edge. Instead, they lingered in the hills, their presence steady but not pressing. The villagers, though still uneasy, began to breathe easier. Work returned slowly, though watchful eyes still flicked often to the horizon. The boy was no longer ignored. Some villagers still distrusted him, but others softened, realizing he had not brought destruction. The older woman spoke to him for the first time, offering food without secrecy. The farmhand gave him a nod of respect, no longer hesitant. Even the blacksmith, though bitter, said nothing more aloud. At night, the boy often walked to the river. The dog would splash at the edges, and he would sit with his knees pulled tight, staring at the water that had changed everything, he thought. Of the leader's steady eyes, the warrior's quiet gesture at the moon, the bond he had never asked for but could not deny. He thought of the village, fearful yet bound to him now, as much as he was bound to the riders. The truth, he realized, was simple yet heavy. Saving the dog had not been an accident. It had been a choice, and that choice had been seen. The Apaches had not come for the village. They had come for the boy who had chosen to act when no one else would. The boy who had leaped into the rushing current, not for reward, not for recognition, but simply because it was right. The dog curled against him, warm and alive, a reminder of that moment. He knew now that he was not powerless, not invisible. The world had noticed, and it had answered. As summer stretched on, the riders gradually moved farther into the hills, their presence less constant, though never gone. The villagers began to believe peace might last. The boy felt the weight ease from his shoulders, though he knew deep down that his life would never again be simple. The bond had been made, and bonds such as these were not broken. Still, he was not afraid. For the first time in his life, he carried something greater than hunger and loneliness. He carried meaning. The Apaches had shown him that, even if he did not yet fully understand why. The villagers had begun to see it too, though they might never admit it aloud. The river flowed on, steady and unyielding, just as it always had. The boy often returned to it, watching the current carry on, remembering the moment everything had changed. He did not know what the future held, whether the riders would return or the village would ever truly accept him. But he knew one thing. With certainty, he had been given a place in a story larger than himself, and that story was only beginning. The dog pressed its head into his hand, and he smiled faintly, the tension of the past week softening at last. The river whispered on, the fields swayed with the wind, the boy lifted his gaze to the horizon where the hills rose. knowing that whatever lay ahead, he was no longer alone. And though the world remained uncertain, he understood now that even the smallest act of courage could call forth forces greater than anyone could imagine. It was not fear that defined him, nor loneliness, but the choice he had made that day at the river. The choice to save a life, and in doing so, to change his own. The boy and the dog walked back toward the village, the path dim under the fading light. Behind them, the river sang on, carrying its secret, carrying its truth. And ahead, both village and hills waited, two worlds bound by a boy who had once been invisible, now seen by all.